Whatsoever. You know what happens if you don't suggest anything? I have to do all the work. Okay. So, just a moment. I'll think of something. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just I'll start recording. We concluded last time. We dealt with, there we go. We dealt with the beginnings of the Hungarian form of Orthodoxy, and now I want to elaborate on it a bit more since Chatam Sofer Rabbi Moshe Schreiber passed away in 1930 and 39. So when he passed away, despite the fact that already there were polemics and debates regarding questions of there still was not. Wait, is it okay? Oh, you can't hear me? I'll just now is it better? Okay, let's hope for the best. Okay. Uh, Despite the fact that there were some debates regarding the hierarchy of of the rabbinic world, and you did have some, I wouldn't call them reformists, but some uh, who challenged the strict halachic perspectives of Hungarian Jewry. Still, they were not organized in something that you could define as a different sect, as another form of religious identification. It took a few more decades to for that to evolve, and usually the most important date that is given is around 1868. Did I mention the Congress, the Hungarian Congress last time? The debates in the Hungarian Jewish Congress, did I mention that?
Briefly.
Briefly. Okay, so I'll do so now. Due to some philo-Semitic philo-Semitic sentiments within the Austro-Hungarian government in the mid or in the 60s of the 19th century, the Hungarian government wanted to make the funding that is funneled to the Jewish communities, wanted to make it official and to make it very I wouldn't say substantial, but they wanted everything to be official, and they wanted the whole idea of the support that the Austro-Hungarian government gives, the monarchy, of course, gives to the Jewish communities. They wanted it to be according to strict rules, and they wanted the Jewish self-identification to be autonomous as it can. Now, this raised some unexpected issues because what the government actually expected the Jews to do was to form an alliance of all of the Jewish communities throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire, most of which, or almost, the vast majority of which were Hungarian. Some were in Slovakia, but most of the Jews in Slovakia identified themselves as Hungarian. Some were in Austria, but not that many. They wanted them to actually have some self-definition, to create rules regarding who exactly in the community is considered the representative of the community to the mayors, to the governments, to the local authorities. And they wanted all of the communities to have a structure which can be duplicated and thus can make the government's job better in working with them. Now, what this actually resulted in was mayhem, because what happened was that suddenly people began to think, wait, who exactly is the majority of the Jewish community? Who said only the rabbis or very specific lay people have the power and the and should be our representatives? Maybe we should be more democratic. Maybe we should allow other people to participate in the leadership of the communities, and not only to be delegates to the government, but also to have an opinion when it comes to how we run our own communities. That is, they actually took the idea of an autonomous congregation and community to the next level. If we are autonomous in front of the government, maybe we should be autonomous in our own self-ruling. And thus, and by the way, it seems that the neologues, that is, those who were very critical of the old-fashioned leadership, they came prepared to this Congress. What they actually said was, wait, we are the majority, at least in many major towns and cities. As a rule of thumb, the closer you get to urban areas in Hungary, the more liberal and modern the community was. Whereas the more you go to rural areas, the more you go to old-fashioned forms of towns and communities. By the way, generally speaking, that's how most of humanity is split. Generally speaking, in urban areas, you have more modern, liberal communities, whereas in rural areas, you have more conservative, more old-fashioned people. Many reasons for that. I'm not a sociologist nor an anthropologist, so I'm not going to go into that in length. Just it is what it is. So what actually came to be is that during the days of the Congress, it became clearer and clearer from day to day that the neologues are going to be the majority of the delegates of the Jewish Congress. That is, they will conquer not only the political establishment of the Jewish community, but also the financial establishment of the Jewish community. Now, this became specifically critical to many Orthodox, even though they weren't considered Orthodox up to that point, or more old-fashioned leadership and congregations, because suddenly what this meant was that Jewish education that gets funding from the state, that Jewish mikvaot and shchita, slaughtering, all of those institutions within the community will actually be part of the Neolog establishment because now they are considered the official representatives of the Jewish community to the government, and thus they will have the money, they will have the power. So rabbis who come from a more old-fashioned conservative background will now not have the capabilities, will not have the resources to lead their communities in the way they were expected to, or in the way they thought fitting, because now the money and the legal uh, uh, authority in the community was in many places in modern hands. This was a tectonic break in the Jewish community in Hungary, mainly because for those who came from the Orthodox areas, they perceived this as an attempt to annihilate their religious way of life. Now, this is where we must understand the big difference between what happened in Hungary and what happened in Germany. In Germany, the reform movement, of course, wanted to have its autonomous establishment, its autonomous institutions, its autonomous temples, yet they never attempted to dethrone the Orthodox rabbis and to uproot Orthodox communities. Whereas in Hungary, at least in the eyes of the Orthodox leadership, what was happening now is a coup. Okay, this is an event where some neolog leaders are in fact taking hostage all of the Jewish community in Hungary and preventing these Jews from receiving the religious services they deserve and giving them not second best, but a shallow image of what Judaism should look like. Because now they won't have the possibility to educate their children in the community establishment. They won't have easy access to kosher food. They won't have easy access to mikveh. And in fact, maybe their synagogues will be taken from them. They won't even have a say in the prayers and services. So this was really a life-threatening situation for many in the Orthodox movement. Now, this resulted in two very important developments. One that we can consider as a more moderate, and I'm saying moderate here in a very relative way, but one could be considered a more moderate response, and the other a much more radical response. Let's begin with the moderate response. And again, I'm speaking here relatively, okay? The more moderate response was, well, okay, you want to have your relative share in the funding and in the establishment of the Jewish community, fine by us. But we want out. That is, the Orthodox congregations, at least the vast majority of them, by their leaderships, said, we want a whole new definition of what our Jewish community should look like. That is, they came to the government, specifically, by the way, to the emperor, Franz Joseph II, and they requested an autonomous status as Orthodox communities that are separate from the general Jewish community. That is, they wanted to detach themselves from the general Jewish communities and to establish independent and detached communities that will be Orthodox, and that the major identification, at least in their words, was their declaration of adherence to the Shulchan Aruch, to the laws of halacha as they are reflected in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, this took some time, but a year and a half approximately after the Congress, indeed, they got what they wanted, and they were declared the Orthodox communities. The Orthodox stream was declared as an autonomous stream, official autonomous stream of Jewish life in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Moreover, not all Jewish Orthodox communities wanted to separate themselves from the general communities due to financial questions and some due to ideological questions. And thus, another stream erupted. This stream called themselves the status quo. And what it meant was that these are communities who lived by and according to the Orthodox way of life, yet they still perceive themselves as part of the general community. So now we have three religious streams of Jewish communities in Hungary. One, Neolog, another, Orthodox, and another tiny part in between, which is called status quo. By the way, this just to let you know, just to update you, up until today, this day, 2026, still the state, the Republic of Hungary, identifies three independent Jewish streams of life: Neolog, Orthodox, and status quo. Despite the fact that no status quo Jew has been spotted in Hungary for 50 years. But still, there is a status quo stream. By the way, any idea who took over the status quo? If you know anything about Jewish communities in the diaspora, the answer is quite easy. Who took over the status quo is now are getting the money? It's an easy question. Once you hear the answer, you'll kick yourself.
The Reform?
No, there are no Reform Jews in Hungary. Who's getting the money of the status quo nowadays in Hungary? Once I'll say the answer, you'll kick yourself for not answering. Chabad, of course, Chabad. Now, Chabad have nothing to do with status quo. Chabad are ultra-Orthodox. However, Chabad know how to, they know their logistics. They know how to get the money from the state in order to fund their campaigns. By the way, I'm not criticizing them. On the contrary, I applaud them. I have only one criticism, which is, why didn't I think of it before them? Okay? Because nowadays Chabad are getting money from the state as if they are status quo. Now, you can go to the government and say, well, they're not status quo. Who cares? You think the Hungarian government cares who these Jews are and what stream do they belong to? On the contrary, for the Hungarian government, you must understand, it's a relief. Because after the Holocaust and after the fall of the Iron Wall and the collapse of the communist regime, nowadays Hungary is attempting desperately, one must say, attempting to be part of Europe's rehabilitation. Now, what happened was that when they began to see the path that the EU is coercing on all of its parts, I'm not going into politics, I'm just trying to explain their point of view. Then within Hungary, a protest erupted because they believed that the Hungarian way of life will be affected negatively by these progressive ultra postmodern European trends. Okay, so Hungary is now in a deadlock because on the one hand, they're afraid of the communists, they're afraid of Russia. On the other hand, they're afraid of their identity being wiped out if they adhere to, for example, the European legislation regarding immigrants, okay, and regarding gay rights and so on and so forth. Now, again, I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just explaining what's going on in Hungary. So nowadays, Hungary does not have too many allies in the world. One of the allies, of a very strong ally to Hungary nowadays, a lot of cooperation, by the way, is going on with Hungary is Israel. Why is that? Because despite the fact that he was blamed to be anti-Semite, Orban, now the Hungarian prime minister, is in fact very pro-Israel. Now, I'm not saying he's pro-Israel because he thinks Israel is the best place in the world. No, just he needs someone to help him. And Israel is now considered at least a regional empire. And nowadays, cooperation, academic, technological, and cultural cooperation between Hungary and Israel are very much at a high level. By the way, next week, if any of you come to Bar-Ilan University, I'm holding a conference that I'm hosting with my partners from Hungary on Wednesday and Thursday. I can share the program if you want. Yeah, why not? This is a program. Here you can see it now. It's in the chat. That's going to take place next week. And we'll have another conference in May in Hungary. So for Hungary, the fact that they can fund Jewish communities, I mean, it's peanuts when you look at the annual budget of the state. But it's a declaration. It's a declaration that they welcome Jewish life in Hungary and they want to promote the Jewish contribution to the Hungarian nation. By the way, it is indeed nowadays quite friendly. I mean, I don't know if any of you travel too much, but just I'm sorry, Jordan, that I'm always talking to you about this. But for example, if I need to go to Montreal or Toronto, uh, in 2 months' time, I will hesitate on wearing my yarmulke in public. I'll be honest. I'm not sure this hesitation is justified, but from what I hear from a lot of people coming back from Canada nowadays, some places in Canada, strolling in the street with a yarmulke might be unpleasant. Okay, I'm not saying dangerous, but unpleasant. I might get some remarks. I'm not sure if that's true, but Jordan, is it true?
Yeah, you'll get slurs, harassment.
Okay, so
Uh,
why would I want to get harassed and slurred? Okay. However, in Budapest, and not only in Budapest, in all of Hungary, rural and urban areas, and I can tell you this from my own experience in the last 4 or 5 years. I've been to Hungary, I think, 8 or 9 times. I've never, ever encountered any problem whatsoever going with a yarmulke alone in every place. Not even a word. No one dared to say a word. Not many places nowadays in the world. It used to be so in Germany, by the way. Nowadays, in some parts of Germany, it is a bit difficult. I can tell you that. Uh, Last year, I was in Frankfurt and I hesitated for the first time in many years because I visited Germany many times and I usually always went with a yarmulke. Nowadays in Germany, it is problematic. In the UK, I won't dare go with a yarmulke. I can tell you, I was in Oxford, I was in London. It's frightening. By the way, in Oxford, every second apartment has an anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish poster on it. So it really is frightening. Again, I'm not going into politics. I'm just sharing my experience. Okay, Hungary nowadays is the safest place for Jews with identification marks. Okay, with very. I mean, it's not difficult to identify me as a Jew when I'm going with a yarmulke. Okay, but I can speak Hebrew everywhere in Hungary, everywhere. Moreover, many places will even greet me and share their joy seeing me when I identify myself as Israeli, as a Jew. It's as simple as that. I guess some rural areas I won't be that uh, uh, I won't be outspoken with hey, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew. Okay, but still no one will dare do anything. And it's quite striking. I mean, one would think that Hungary, which isn't considered one of the leading progressive nations in the world, would be a difficult place for Jews to go and stroll. But no. By the way, there's another European country nowadays that is very safe for Jews, which is Czechia. Okay, Poland used to be, but nowadays it has become a bit more. I mean, they were all always anti-Semitic, but nowadays they're a bit more outspoken when it comes to they allow themselves to freely uh, uh, get give you the feeling that you're not wanted there. Hungary, Czechia, no problem whatsoever, which I find quite amazing. Okay, so let's get back to, of course, it wasn't like that. I mean, when my grandmother grew there, Hungary was one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world. By the way, Hungary is the first European country to have numerus clausus laws in their universities. Long before Germany, in Hungary, Jews were not accepted only in very small quantities in Hungarian universities. That was, I'm already talking about the 20s of the 20th century. But nowadays, again, the situation is much different. I must say, what I hear from my friends and colleagues in Hungary, it's not that Hungary became non-anti-Semitic. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in Hungary. However, it isn't vocal because of Orban's reign in Hungary. People, even those who are anti-Semitic, are afraid to express their anti-Semitic tendencies and ideas. Well, for me, it's close enough. I mean, it's it's better than getting slurs in the street. Okay, so as I said, we have the Orthodox, the Neolog, and the status quo streams that are officially recognized by the country as legitimate streams of Judaism that get separate funding and separate delegations and representation in front of the country. They are considered as autonomous streams that have their legitimacy to live their religious lives however they want and not be coerced to be part of any congregation in which they do not feel at home. They do not feel part of. So the Orthodox community can be separate from the Neo community. That was the declaration in around 1868, 1869. However, that was the moderate form. Okay, I'm saying it's relatively moderate because it isn't moderate because it's way, way, way worse than what happened in Germany. In Germany, the congregations did not separate up to that point. There is an exception, and I will speak about that exception, but not today, maybe next week. Okay, but generally speaking, all of German Orthodox communities were part of what they call Gemeinde. You know what the word Gemeinde Gemeinde is a community, okay? The Jewish Gemeinde, the Jewish community, was considered one institution in all German municipalities, towns, cities, whatever. And within that institution, you had various streams, various some synagogues were Orthodox, some temples were Reformed, and so on and so forth. Now I'm coming to the more radical response to the Congress and the separation between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews in Hungary. And this actually, by the way, quite ironically, this happened in a town called Mikhailovca. Now, the word Mikhailovca, uh, what language does it sound like? Anyone? Mikhailovca. What does that sound? Does that sound Hungarian? Of course, the answer is no. It doesn't sound Hungarian because nowadays it in fact is not Hungarian. As you can see here. Oh, wait, I didn't share my screen. Nowadays, Mikhailovce is in Slovakia. You can see it here. Okay, this is a border between Hungary and Slovakia. Okay, this is Hungary, Budapest here. And you can see Debrecen is around here. You can see Debrecen and Miskolc here. Now, Košice, Kashoy. Košice is a town, a city, actually, in Slovakia. And here, near Košice, you can see Mikhailovce. Yeah, can you see it? Mikhailovce, as you can see, is a town on the Laborec River in eastern Slovakia, originally named after the archangel Saint Michael. Okay, now in Hungary, or during those times, Slovakia, at least most of Slovakia, was part of Hungary, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And during those times, Mikhailovca had a Hungarian name, and its Hungarian name was Mihailovic. Now, Mihailovic is a very Hungarian name. By the way, many times if you deal with Hungary, and specifically if any of you want to write any papers on Hungary, you must know that almost all of the towns in the Hungarian area, at least those in Transylvania or in Slovakia and the other regions, most of them have no less than 3 different names. And the reason for that is that all of them have a Hungarian name, a German name, and the name of the place nowadays under whichever country it is. For example, the capital of Slovakia is. Does anyone know what's the capital of Slovakia?
Bratislava.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Bratislava. Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia, but under the Austro-Hungarian regime, it was called Pressburg. Pressburg is its German name, and the Hungarian name for Pressburg and Bratislava is Pozsony. Okay, so Pozsony is Pressburg, is Bratislava. For example, on the other side of the aisle, you have a very major town in Romania, in Transylvania. In fact, I think it's the biggest city in Transylvania. It's called Cluj. Cluj is the Romanian name. However, the German name was Klausenburg. And the Hungarian name was Kolozsvár. Okay? So when you hear of Cluj, Kolozsvár, Klausenburg, it's the same place. Same applies to Mikhailovce. That's the Slovakian name, whereas Mihailovic is the Hungarian name. Now, in Mihailovic, and by the way, as you could see in the map, Mihailovic is or could not be considered a central place in the Hungarian in Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's a rural area. It's not even a suburb of any major town. Okay, so there's a reason why some individuals convened in Mikhailovca and they gathered there in order to create a set of new rules that will be the identifiers. They will be the sole rules, the one would even say the constitution of the Orthodox communities to come. Now, when we talk about the Mikhailovich Convention, we must understand that the true Orthodox leaders of the time were not part of it. That is, most of the major players within the Orthodox communities, such as the descendants of Moshe Sofer, the Khatam Sofer, his greatest student, Maharam Shik, Rabbi Moshe Shuk, and all of the other great leaders of the Orthodox communities were not part of the Mikhailovich Convention. Yet some, listen, I'm not trying to call them mid-tier because I'm not trying to insult anyone, but I would say that if we discuss their public status, I'm not talking about their intellectual capacities, about their cognitive abilities, but their public status was mid-tier. Okay? You have a convention of mid-tier rabbis, and they declared that from now on, whoever wants to be part of the Orthodox community is now obliged to uh, adhere to some very strict rules and laws. One of which, for example, no sermons in any language besides Hebrew and Yiddish should be allowed in the synagogue. Now, here's the catch. Most of the Jews in Hungary didn't know any other language. They did not know Hebrew, nor did they know Yiddish, because most of the Jews in Hungary were not Yiddish speakers. Yiddish speakers, generally speaking, were in more eastern areas of Europe and not Central Europe. Most of the Jews in Central Europe spoke German. In Hungary, many spoke Hungarian. Some also spoke Romanian. It depends on where exactly they lived. Most of them did not speak Hebrew, nor did they know Yiddish. Now, why did these rabbis try to prevent any sermons that are not Hebrew or Yiddish? Let's think together. What was their intention? What were they trying to achieve? Vladi, I haven't heard any word of you today. What do
Well,
you
I don't know. It's actually quite a dangerous step because, as always, you keep conservative. You prevent new ideas like coming with a new language, but at the same time, you might lose your own audience.
Indeed. I just heard a podcast discussing the problems of and God forbid me for the equation I'm now creating. Okay, I'm not trying to equate anything, but I heard the very interesting podcast discussing the protests in Iran. Okay, and why they are significantly and inherently different than those who occurred a few years ago regarding the hijab. You remember a few years ago, there was the hijab protests because of a woman that was beaten to death by the Basij, by the police, by the vice parts of the police, because how dare she show her face? You remember that? So a few years ago, there were protests regarding that. And I heard a podcast, very interesting, discussing why now the Iranian regime has a lot less power and a lot less leeway to prevent these protests from spreading to all of the country. And the reason is the following. At first, when you had these protests on the hijab, what they could do was they could say, you know what? Okay, you get what you want, and will allow a more lenient policy to be implemented. Yet on the other side, they killed 500 protesters. Okay, so they played this ambiguous game with the protesters. On the one hand, they gave them a so-called victory, whereas on the other hand, they killed all of their major opponents. Now, what the problem is that most of the protests started because of the economical situation. Now, the thing is that the government in Iran cannot promise anything with regards to the economic conditions. What can they say? Okay, we'll stop the 100% inflation? They can't because they have sanctions and because their economy sucks. What will they say? We'll give you water? They can't because they don't have water. Tehran is sinking, literally, by the way. Tehran as a city is sinking 10 centimeters, almost like 4 inches a year. The city is sinking because they took all of the water from beneath it and the land isn't stable. So Tehran, a city with more than 10 million people, is sinking and it's dying. It doesn't have water. The taps are dry. What can they do? What can they say? Okay, take water, take money. They don't have any money. Moreover, the thing is that they let this spread. And now a problem is that the police people, the gendarmes, the army, their salaries are also defunct. They're also not getting money. They also can't feed their families. So this is a very difficult problem. They can't say, okay, we'll give you something, but you give us something back, because they don't have any room for negotiations with the people. So the situation now is very dire for the regime. I'm not saying they're going to collapse soon. I don't know. I have no idea, but it's very different. Now, if I return to Vladi, there's no doubt that this is an act of uh, 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 of desperate sentiments. Okay, if you declare that any sermon which isn't in Hebrew or Yiddish is forbidden, you're trying to threaten people that you'll kick them out of the community. But what you're actually doing is kicking people out of the community. In other words, there's a phrase in Hebrew, I guess it's also in many other languages: don't ever threat if you don't want to take action. Okay? If you're not willing to pay the price of a threat, it's better for you to not threat to begin with. Okay? If you say, I'm going to kill you if you don't do anything, if you do something, and you're not actually going to kill anyone, then it's better for you not to threat, because you're bluffing and your bluff will show. Okay? Life isn't a poker game. When you're bluffing, it tends to show. So when they say, we're going to kick you out of the community, people will just ask themselves, why the hell do I want to be in this kind of a community? In this kind of a hostile community, a community that does not accept me and does not respect me, and its leadership won't even speak to me in the language that I know. So they want me to learn a new language? Moreover, other very strict laws, which some of which do have sources in rabbinic literature, but we cannot say that they are considered mainstream laws, were implemented as criteria for being part of the Orthodox community. Now, the idea was, let's raise the walls. Let's prevent everyone from leaking out of the community. But as the saying goes, the horses are already outside. You can't bring them back. People want to go outside of the community because the community does not respect them. And what happened is that gradually, more and more and more Jews abandoned the Orthodox way of life. In Hungary, we're talking about approximately 70% of the Jews in Hungary that were part of the Neolog communities, and only 30 or 25% remained Orthodox. Now, the picture isn't even that positive from an Orthodox perspective because of these quarter of the Jews that remained Orthodox, the vast majority of them lived in rural, low socioeconomical areas. Whereas in the major cities, the non-Orthodox, the Neolog communities had funding, they had textile moguls, they had very important leaders that also achieved political status. They were thriving, whereas the Orthodox community was in fact declining. Now, here's where things get tricky. Because as we can see, what's going on here is that this is a very difficult situation for the Orthodox communities. Because what's going on is that these communities now are bleeding followers. People don't want to be part of the Orthodox community. And what is the response? What do you do when you start losing people? Instead of thinking of ways to reinvent your communities as more attractive, as more friendly, as more inclusive, many of the Orthodox leaders went the exact opposite way. They took even a more heated rhetoric as their way of speech. They began using horrific imageries when it comes to describing the non-Orthodox Jews. They began to treat the non-Orthodox Jews as non-Jews at home. And this really I'm not going to give you examples because, believe me, it hurts me, okay, to speak of this, since this is my job, so I have to read it. But I can tell you that many times it's painful. Okay, you see very harsh and completely unproportional rhetoric that accuses non-Orthodox Jews of the most horrific sins and the most horrific behavior, even though, in fact, it had nothing to do with reality. On the opposite side of the aisle, non-Orthodox leaders themselves also didn't do any attempt to actually decrease the level of anxiety within Orthodox communities, because if we can recall, the whole thing began because some non-Orthodox groups attempted to dethrone Orthodox leadership and, in fact, to get the Orthodox communities bankrupt. They wanted to take their money, their finances. They wanted to take over the Jewish establishment and thus, indeed, to, in fact, annihilate the Orthodox way of life. So, I think both sides contributed a lot to this very desperate situation in which Hungarian Jewry became split into fractions that suffered from very, very problematic rhetoric. Everyone was at everyone else's throat, and the situation was really, really, uh, I mean, to a bystander, and I consider myself a bystander, despite the fact that I come from a strict Hungarian Orthodox family nowadays. I must say that it's painful. I mean, I just last year I was in a conference in Hungary, and during that conference we had a tour into several Neolog synagogues. I think I visited 4 or 5 Neolog synagogues. I must mention that I never entered a Neolog synagogue in my life before that, because in my family it was considered a sin to enter a Neolog synagogue, like entering a church. What do you have to look to in a church? Now, once I visited the Neolog synagogues, I must say that suddenly you realize, well, there's not that big of a difference. As opposed to, by the way, as opposed to temples, Reformed temples, that are very different, very different. The choreography is different. The liturgy is different. The architecture is different. Then synagogues, well, Neolog synagogues really look like Orthodox synagogues. The prayer is identical. The music is identical. The whole thing is, again, some have organs and some don't have organs. But even those who do have organs, they don't use Jewish players on Shabbat, only non-Jews. And at least from a communal perspective, just a moment. Wow, okay.
Bless you.
Yeah. It is what it is. So at least for a communal perspective, the Jewish Neolog communities do observe kashrut. That is in their, I mean, I have no idea what's going on in each and every one families, in each and every family's home, okay? I guess most of the families do not observe the Shabbat and do not observe kashrut, yet within the public sphere of the Neolog communities, there is a lot of strictly Orthodox rules that are adhered to. Moreover, and this is a more up-to-date issue, the Neolog communities are very, very pro-Israel and Zionist. What I can say about well, nowadays, actually, there are practically no non-Chabad Orthodox communities in Hungary, which is kind of, I mean, it's kind of shocking because 20 years ago, they did have a functioning Orthodox community. Now they don't, only Chabad. But the Neolog community is extremely pro-Israel and pro-Zionism. By the way, to a point that I haven't seen anything like that in any other Jewish community in the world. That is to say, you see more Zionist ornamentation in neolog synagogues than you see in most of Israeli synagogues. Okay? Uh, it's quite clear that they have a very firm identification and empathy to the state of Israel. And I mean, from my perspective, it's very subjective, but I find it heartwarming, specifically in harsh times when you see that you have your brethren in the diaspora that are very fond of you and care for you and feel they share the same fate. I think it's quite fascinating. Okay, let's hear some musical piece.
Could I please ask a question before
Yeah,
we
sure,
go
sure,
to
of
music?
course.
Who were the Orthodox communities at that time? Were there like monolithic? Were there Hasidic movements, Misnagdim? Who were they?
Okay, that's a very good question. Generally speaking, most of Hungarian Jews were not Hasidic. You do have some specific Hasidic dynasties that entered Hungary and had some impact, mostly in Transylvania and an area called Marboros-Sziget, which is nowadays on the northern side of Transylvania. Just to name a few Hasidic dynasties that were very powerful in the Hungarian areas. First and foremost, Sanz Hasidic court, and you also have some smaller courts, Vizhnitz, Munkac, Satmar, and Siget. So you do have some Hasidic communities. Again, most of them are in the far east of Hungary, in the areas of Marboros-Sziget and Transylvania. Whereas in what is called the Uberland of Hungary, that is the more fancy schmancy Jews who consider themselves more worthy, no Hasidic, well, not no, okay, but practically no Hasidic entrance to those areas up until the Holocaust. In the years before the Holocaust, you did find some Hasidic communities, very tiny, in these areas. Most of these areas of Hungarian towns and cities were mitnagdim. Yet, not like, or not, as opposed to Poland and Lithuania, where the mitnagdim Hasidim debates were very harsh and extreme, in Hungary, it was less of an issue. It wasn't an ideological question, but more of, I'll say the following. The Hasidim fought themselves much more than they fought the non-Hasidim. Okay? The Hasidic communities in Hungary, they fought themselves on a daily basis. Okay? You have horrible, horrible wars between Sanz and Belz and Munkac and see, oh my God, that was horrible. Whereas with the general community, I mean, you did have some differences, and you did have some different point of views, and sometimes even some quarrels, but it wasn't something major. Hasidism wasn't a major issue in Hungarian Judaism. Okay, I mean, again, in the eastern parts, there were a lot of Hasidim, but in the true, I would say, the original Hungarian areas and communities, Hasidism was not a thing. Okay, let's hear some music. Any suggestions? Maybe something. Oh, I know. Let's hear Liszt. Liszt, of course, was Hungarian. His name nowadays is called Franz Liszt, right? But his original Hungarian name was Ferenc Liszt. That sounds better. Yeah.
עברו שעות אחרונות להשקיע בחברת אנבלה. זאת הזדמנות נהדרת.
Okay. That was A great example of the powers of the algorithm of YouTube. Okay, so as we reach the end of the 19th century, we can see the peak of the debate of the quarrels between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. And I want to focus a bit on some of the halachic perspectives of this debate, because I think people underestimate the ramifications of this horrible quarrel and some of the halachic implications it had. For example, generally speaking, well, you know what? Let me be a bit clearer here. It isn't quite clear to me, and when I discuss this with historians, I get the understanding that I have somewhat of a perverted understanding of this schism between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Let me explain. The halachic rhetoric of this debate reached heights that are completely unprecedented. That is, the sanctions that Orthodox rabbis put on those who did not adhere to Orthodox halacha are simply, I mean, just, for example, it was, generally speaking, a problem to be a mohel, okay, to circumcise non-Orthodox Jews. In most of the congregations, Orthodox Jews did not take part in the burial of non-Orthodox Jews. They had different cemeteries. It wasn't only because different congregations have different cemeteries. This was part of the sanctions. It was part of the way that for the Orthodox communities to not only alienate the non-Orthodox Jews, but almost to dehumanize them in order to justify their own perspectives and the walls that they raised between them and their brethren. More examples. Orthodox rabbis did not marry non-Orthodox couple. They did not participate at all in their weddings, nor as guests, and nor as rabbis that officiated in the weddings, and so on and so forth. So they practically treated them as non-Jews. Moreover, I must say, in some places, when you look into how Haredi, ultra-Orthodox communities behave today, when it comes to non-Orthodox communities or individuals, some practice Hungarian or follow Hungarian footsteps in how they treat non-Orthodox Jews. For example, the Satmar Hasidism, which is very powerful in North America, of course, in the New York State region, when you have Williamsburg in Brooklyn, but also, of course, Monsey and Kiryas Yoel in Monroe County, all of these areas. This is the Hungarian way of life, okay? Strictly stripping themselves from any relationship with those who are non-Orthodox. By the way, it's not even non-Orthodox. It reaches a point where they also alienate themselves from Orthodox communities who aren't exactly as they believe they should look like. There's a famous joke that a Belz Chassid went to the Chevra Kadisha, the cemetery organization of Satmar, and asked to buy a burial place in their cemetery. So they said, "Of course, we'll sell it to you, but why on earth would a Belz Chassid want to buy a burial place in a Satmar cemetery?" Well, he said, "Because I heard that the Satmar worms don't eat bells." Okay? So that's a joke about the kashrut stringency and the fact that even the worms that are in the Satmar cemetery don't dare eat bells. Okay? Now, it's a joke, but it's a very sad joke because it reflects reality in a very vivid way. This is exactly how Hungarian Orthodoxy presented itself. Just to give you an example, and I know this secondhand, not firsthand. My grandmother told me she was born to an Orthodox community in Budapest. Okay, now Budapest, they were the modern, okay, Orthodox community. I'm not talking about Eastern Hungary, the Hasidic areas. I'm talking about urban, downtown Hungary, downtown Budapest, okay? And it appears that in the mikveh, they used to check their lists. And if a woman did not attend the mikveh for 3 months consecutively, she would be summoned to a hearing. And if she did not have good enough explanations for her absence from the mikveh, it was published in the synagogue. There was a pamphlet prohibiting drinking a glass of water in that family's home. Okay, so this is the extent to which this state of mind reached. Okay, we're not talking here about non-Orthodox families. We're talking about Orthodox families, part of the Orthodox community. And this is the level of zealous ideology when it comes to separating me from anyone who isn't as strict, as obedient, as firm in their beliefs and their behavior as I am. Needless to say, this is not something that can be sustainable. Okay. I'll cite a colleague of mine, Professor Michal Shaul. She's a historian of the Holocaust. If we look at the numbers before the Holocaust, then, and this is as opposed to some popular myth regarding the Holocaust, the percentage of Jews who were observant before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust is actually quite similar. Okay? The percentage of Jews before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust who perceive themselves and identify themselves as observant Jews is quite similar. Okay? By the way, in the past 20, 30 years throughout the Jewish population throughout the world, the percentage is rising of observant Jews. This is the first time for at least 150 years, if not more than that, that the percentage of observant Jews is rising. But the main reason it's rising is because of assimilation, because of the fact that many non-observant Jews assimilate, whereas within observant circles, the numbers are lower, okay? And of course, it's demography, the fact that observant Jews tend to have more children than non-observant Jews. By the way, in Israel, for example, it is very, very punctuated. It's crystal clear. The numbers are for religious families. The average is approximately 4 or 4.2 children per family. Whereas in non-religious families in Israel nowadays, the numbers are around 2.5 children. Okay, so the numbers are staggering, and this has a demographic uh, 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 effect, of course. By the way, in Israel nowadays, the non-Jewish population has declined severely in their birth rates. Up until the 90s, the birth rates of non-Jewish communities in Israel was higher than of Jewish communities. That hence the predictions of sociologists and demographics was that approximately in the year 2025, 2030, the minorities, the non-Jewish minorities in Israel, will almost become half of the population, whereas from the end of the 90s up to today, the numbers are declining steadily. And nowadays, non-Jewish minorities have less children than non-religious Jewish families. Yeah. So, in fact, the numbers of non-Jewish minorities in Israel, or their percentage in the population, is in fact declining. Nowadays, it's predicted it's about 27%, something 25, 27%. It's predicted to get even lower than 20% in the next few years, mainly because of the low birth rates. Specifically, by the way, the Druze and the Christian Arabs have the lowest birth rates in all of the different sections of Israeli population. The Druze are actually vanishing from the Israeli state, which proves, by the way, that this is not a result of any discrimination or harsh treatment by the government, because in fact, the Druze and the Christian Arabs are an integral part of the Israeli society, as opposed to many of the Muslim Arabs who kind of find themselves in between identities. So the Druze, they draft to the army, they are part of the civil service, they are part of every area. I mean, I for myself, as you know, I spent more than 300 days in reserve for the past 2 years. And some of my colleagues in the army were Druze. I mean, yeah, many Druze. We have several Druze generals and so on. Just a moment. Just a moment. Sorry, my daughter got a bump in her head. Okay, so just as I said, Michal Shaul, my colleague, well, what she said is that if you look at the numbers, if you crunch them correctly, you see that the numbers of observant Jews relative to the general Jewish population before the war and after the war are quite similar. However, if you look at the numbers of observant Jews from the middle of the 19th century up until the Holocaust, approximately 80, 90 years, you see the numbers are declining drastically as time goes by. So essentially, and this sounds horrible, but you must understand the context, essentially the Holocaust freezed the percentage of observant Jews and prevented their complete collapse. Because were it not for the Holocaust, and according to the trends that persisted for 8 or 9 decades before the Holocaust, the numbers of observant Jews would have continued to decline. So in fact, as opposed to, by the way, what many perceive as a deadly blow to not only the Jewish population, but also to the Jewish faith, In fact, the Holocaust had a completely different impact on Jewish faith, because many would say that it actually preserved it in the sense that it prevented the dismantling of Orthodox communities. Now, I for one, don't like these debates because I think they're grotesque and quite irrelevant, because Jews were killed because they are Jews, not because they are observant or non-observant. But still, it's a point that we must take into consideration when we speak about the decline of Orthodox Jews in Hungary. And in a parallel trend, the rhetoric of Orthodox rabbis against the non-Orthodox Jews just went uphill instead of downhill. They only kept going on and on with their horrible, horrible treatment of non-Orthodox Jews. There were, however, some exceptions for the rule. Some Orthodox leaders did not were not satisfied with the state of issues here. I will mention a few that were considered. I mean, there were many who disliked this trend, but they were not considered as important Orthodox leaders, so they didn't have that much of an impact. The rise of Zionism did have something to, or did have an impact on the relationship between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. And this is something very interesting because has any of you visited Budapest, by the way? Okay, so if you visit Budapest, you can see the Dohány Utca synagogue, which is one of the largest synagogues in the world, and I don't know, allegedly the biggest in Europe. I'm not sure that's true, but never mind. A house near it, just a house by it, they have a small museum dedicated to Herzl, and the reason is that Herzl was born in that street, in that home. Okay, so Herzl comes from a Hungarian family. And despite some roots of proto-Zionism in Hungary, most of the early Zionists came from Russian areas. Actually, to be more accurate, Hungary had the least Zionists relative to its population of all of Europe. That is, the numbers of Zionists, of Jewish Zionists in Hungary was one of the lowest in all of Europe, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Zionism was a non-issue in Hungary. Now, there were some very prominent Hungarian Orthodox and non-Orthodox Zionists, but generally speaking, they were an exception, and they were not a mainstream trend. One of the most famous and important Hungarian leaders who was a Zionist, not only a Zionist, but he was a functionary in the Zionist movement, he was a very important and prominent Zionist, was Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Glasner. Now, Rabbi Glasner is very important. By the way, a book dedicated to him was recently published by a friend of mine, Yoav Sorek, Dr. Yoav Sorek. Rabbi Glasner was an Orthodox leader. Moreover, he wasn't just an Orthodox leader, he was also the great-grandchild of Rabbi Moshe Sofer, Chatam Sofer. He was rabbi of Cluj, Klausenburg, Kolozsvár, as I mentioned earlier. It depends on which language you use, the major city in Transylvania. And he was a very prominent and well-known leader in Hungarian Orthodoxy. He wrote a book, or a booklet would be a more accurate description. He wrote a booklet dedicated to Zionism in light of faith. Now, this booklet was published in German. As you recall, the very strict the very strict Orthodox rabbis, those mid-tier rabbis from the Mikhailovich Convention, prohibited any non-Jewish language sermons. Any sermon in Hebrew or Yiddish is acceptable, but in other languages, it is, of course, unheard of. No one may be allowed to write or to give a sermon in German. But here you have a rabbi publishing a booklet, an ideological booklet, in German. Now, since I see our time is up, I'll focus on this next time. Well, and we will discuss some of his perspectives on Zionism. However, I mainly want to discuss some of his inter-reflections regarding the debate between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. And we will see that when Zionism erupts and when the national question of the redemption of the Jews becomes relevant, suddenly you see other questions, like the debates between Zionism and non-Zionism, or, sorry, debates between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews become a bit irrelevant and kind of anachronistic. But still, we have a lot to speak about this. Any questions?
Yes, actually.
Yeah, sure.
I know he wasn't Hungarian, but is there any relationship between the Chofetz Chaim's excessive focus on Lashon Hara and these sort of the bitterness of these disputes between Orthodox and non-Orthodox? Like,
Okay.
are we going to cover that in the future?
That's a wonderful question. And I must say, I knew of it, but I didn't connect it in my brain right now, because now that you ask it, a good friend of mine composed a PhD thesis on the Chafetz Chaim's Lashon Hara debates and the developments in journalism in East Europe. And his claim, and by the way, it's quite sound, is that the Chafetz Chaim's consistent advocacy against Lashon Hara is in fact a response to the rise of East European Jewish journalism. And what he perceived as a threat on the Jewish way of life, but also on the relationship between Jews to one another, due to the fact that now you can publish harsh words and criticism on everyone, and it becomes public domain, as opposed to in the past when you spoke ill of someone, it was only you and the hearer. It was something that can be contained. But now when it's in the press, it's all over, and it's throughout the world, and it's horrific and disastrous. The Chafetz Chaim he lived in Lithuania and Belarus. He had really nothing to do with Hungary. Moreover, the cultural connections between these areas was very, very poor. Oh, here. Yeah, okay, sorry. These regions were very, very poor, and the Chafetz Chaim was not interested in what's happening in Hungary. There were Lithuanian rabbis who criticized harshly the idea of the schism, of the separation of communities in Lithuania. A notable mention here would be the Netziv of Volozhin, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda of Berlin, Berlin. He was the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva. He has a responsa, a responsum in his book Meshiv Davar, where he criticizes horrifically the idea of separating the congregations, and he says this is a death blow to our Jewish way of life. But generally speaking, what happened in Hungary stayed in Hungary, and what happened in Eastern Europe stayed in Eastern Europe. Very different cultural regions. So the Chafetz Chaim, no, but other Lithuanian rabbis, yes, they did have a say, and they were very skeptical about this Orthodox idea of separation, to a point that for many researchers, historians specifically, describing Eastern European Jewry as Orthodox is in fact incorrect. They weren't Orthodox in the social form of Orthodoxy that it was, how it looked like in Central Europe. They were observant, but it's a different category, and I will elaborate it on that next time. Okay?
So what's your
Great.
friend's name? Sorry, so I can look up the PhD.
His name is Tsuriel Rashi. You spell that Tsurriel, and Rashi, like in Rashi. Maybe I can find his PhD, and if not, I can ask him. Because it was quite fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, here, I found something. Wait a second. Oh, here you can find. Just I'll share. You know there's a site Torat Har Etzion VBM. Okay, there's a lesson by Rav Yonatan Searing. Okay, you know what? I'll share it here on the chat. That he cites a paper that my friend wrote on shaming, and yeah, okay, sure. So no, what did I do? Did it send it? Wait. Oh yeah, okay. Do you see the link? Just open it. He has some reference there, but look it up. It's Uriel Rashi. If you can't find it, then send me an email and I'll try to find it for you. Okay? Great. Okay. So I wish you all a great week, and we'll meet again next week. Okay. Bye-bye.